when you say, for example, what to do is just to survive, to live, to fight. Of course, thinking first of all about people and then about the lands. And that's why they have steps forward. Because when I've got the information so that on one direction the number of people or troops 1 to 8. And of course the signal is to stay, it means to die or to make some steps on more, higher points and etc. and to control it and to save life. Of course, go back, guys. Save soldiers, save people. This is real, this war. But what to do is just to survive.
Russia is slicing its way through Ukrainian defenses was an opening quote from the Economist article of the 29th of October. In Kupiansk, in the north, its troops have cut Ukrainian formations into two at the Oskar River. In Chasiv Yar, in the east, they have crossed the main Siversky Donetsk Canal after 6 months of trying. Farther south, Russian troops have taken high ground in and around Ugledar, and as is most relevant to this video, Russian troops are moving on Kurakhove from 2 directions. Despite the fact that the number of combat clashes dropped by 10% to 970 over the week, 60% of them occurred in the Pokrovsk and Kurakhove sections of the front, which clearly indicated Russia's priorities and objectives. On the Pokrovsk direction, Russia's recent confirmed capture of Selidove brings Russia to within 10 kilometers of the strategic city, which has been evacuated and the streets are now deserted.
28 жовтня. Місто Мирноград.
The breakthrough by Russian forces on the southern Kurakhove front, however, came as a surprise. Within 2 days, the Russians captured 3 critical settlements, which could and was supposed to have held back the Russian advance for weeks or even months. We are talking about the seizure of Shakhtarsk, Novo-Ukranka, and of course, Bohyavlenka, all of which amounted to a breach of the front line over 20 kilometers long. According to Ukrainian media, this rapid advance suggests that neither the main roads nor surrounding areas were adequately fortified. And this does not appear to be just mere speculation or any last-ditch attempt to find a scapegoat for Ukraine's setbacks. Dmitry Sneryov, a Ukrainian military expert, commented on what he viewed as the factors leading to the recent wave of tactical successes for the Russian armed forces. He said as follows: "In fact, there are several factors that contribute to the tactical success of the Russians. These include superiority in manpower, total air superiority and firepower." But then he went on to comment on what he called the external factors, such as the slow nature of military and technical support for Ukraine from strategic partners, as well as, and I quote, "the poor state of engineering and fortification structures in Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions." This, he said, is the main factor that contributed to the tactical success of the Russian forces, when the engineering and fortification structures in Donetsk region, for which, and I quote again, 17 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, or approximately $412 million was allocated, resemble Potemkin villages. And for a history lesson, a Potemkin village is a construction or facade intended to make people believe that a situation is better than it actually is. Originally, it was a name given to fake villages designed to impress the Russian Empress Catherine the Great. In Kurakhove itself, which will be the focus of today's video, the military expert reported that the system of engineering and fortification was built without taking into account the real needs of the armed forces of Ukraine and the nature of the Russian offensive in this area of the front. And he says the situation is similar in the Pokrovsk direction. He comments on several reports that the civil military administrations of Selidove and Mirograd were engaged in outright money laundering rather than construction of engineering and fortification structures.
Доброго дня, панове. Нас перекинули під Покровськ та сказали, тримайтеся, там позиція вистроєна, все є, все буде, все вже Покровська адміністрація вистроїла. Тут і бетон є, укріплення, доти, дзоти та все інше. І я вам зараз покажу, як виглядає лінія бойова за мільйони гривень. Ось, я зараз вам все це покажу. Дивіться, ось це єбана яма, це дерев'яна підлога, ось це бетон, це теж бетон, оце кладіння торчить. Що це? Як це розуміти? Ось це кладіння. Це для кого ростом? Що ми тут будемо стояти обороняти? Це для єбаних ліліпутів. Скільки грошей було потрачено на цю хуйню всю єбану? Мільйон? 10? 15? Скільки?
Lieutenant General Ihor Romanenko, founder of the Let's Close the Sky of Ukraine charitable foundation, reported that Russian forces are advancing around Selidove and Ugledar. In an update on live Ukrainian television, he was quoted as saying the following: "In some areas, the situation is shifting from difficult to critical. This includes the battle zones around Selidove and west of Ugledar, where the enemy is making advances. Because of this, conditions are forming that may allow them to push toward Kurakhove from the south. We understand that the enemy's main goal is through Kurakhove and eventually to capture Pokrovsk." So today we are focusing on the situation on the Kurakhove and Pokrovsk front, which is clearly the most active parts of the front line in Ukraine. We will also highlight parts of the bombshell article from The Economist, which, as its title suggests, indicates that Ukraine is no longer just losing the war, they are in danger of losing their ability to survive as a nation. But before we do, I want you to hit 3 buttons: the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell. And when you're done, drop a little donation via super thanks and assist me in buying a new microphone, which many of you have commented on in the comment section of previous videos. And let's get into it. In southern Donetsk, the Russian forces are now pressing forward without consolidating positions, recently capturing Yasna Polyana. The objective appears to be advancing to the rear of Kurakhove and seizing the Pokrovsk-Velika Novoselka road intersection. The Ukrainian Defense Forces' next critical position lies at the crossroads near Andriivka and Constantinople, where the Vovcha and Suki Yali rivers could serve as natural defense barriers in absence of engineering fortifications. The Russian advance has also created the potential to encircle Kurakhove and establish a flanking position to launch an offensive to Velika Novoselka, a fortified stronghold in southwestern Donetsk that has long impeded Russia's path to Zaporizhia. Despite recent public assurances about the second and third lines of defense in Zaporizhia, Ukrainian media admits that it appears that key settlements that should be currently holding off Russian forces lack sufficient defenses. Several Ukrainian military analysts had warned of the likely fall of Ugledar, Selidove, and Toretsk. Though Toretsk still remains at least somewhat in Ukrainian hands, Kurakhove now seems close to joining this list. Following the loss of Selidove, Russian forces are redirecting resources to intensify their attacks on Kurakhove, now from both southern and northern fronts. Last week, Russian forces seized Hernik, the highest elevation in the Donetsk region. This strategic town, crucial for Ukraine's defense, was held by only one Special Forces battalion, which could not withstand the assault alone. Currently, Ukrainian troops are holding off Russian advances at Kurakhivka, but additional withdrawals from the section appear imminent. Meanwhile, Russian forces are pushing toward Novodetrivka and Novoselidivka, aiming to reach the northern shore of the Vovchansk Reservoir and sever Ukrainian retreat routes. While the Russian advance on Kurakhove from Maximilianivka area has slowed, Russian forces are now pressing along the Donetsk-Kurakhove highway, expanding their control west of Pobieda. Kurakhove is under a three-pronged attack and Ukrainian forces are struggling to establish a defensive line. A Ukrainian journalist on Telegram by the name of Bohdan Miroshnikov confirmed that Ukrainian units recently withdrew from the villages of Gornyak, Izmailivka, and Alexandropol. A quotation from his Telegram channel read as follows: "The enemy is actively pressing Kurakhove. City battles have begun there. I don't think that we will cling to Kurakhove for a long time because the threat of encirclement looms on the horizon." The tenacity of the Ukrainian defenders in holding Kurakhove will influence the timing of any Russian advance on Pokrovsk. Nevertheless, the recent Russian gains in the Kurakhove sector, according to Ukrainian media, presents worrying implications. Following a month of combat, Russian forces have broken through Selidove's defenses, entering Ukraine's southern flank and cutting off key supply lines via Vishneve. The Ukrainian armed forces are forced to withdraw towards Pokrovsk and now control only Vishneve's northwestern outskirts. At the same time, Russian forces are seeking to consolidate their position south of Minograd, which remains poorly defended. Ukrainian forces have managed to repel attacks on Pokrovsk from Lysivka and achieved some local successes on the northern edge of Novohrodovka near a mining area. So if I were to summarize the battlefield position, it seems that Kurakhove is doomed to fall into a Russian encirclement, and after which it is expected that Russia will push towards Pokrovsk. The most concerning aspect of this advance, if I were on the Ukrainian side, is that Donetsk is supposed to be the most fortified area in Ukraine. They had 8 years or since 2014 to build all these fortifications. Yet we are now hearing Ukrainian analysts criticize the administrations in these cities for corruption and accuse them of failure to erect proper defenses. Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute was quoted as identifying several reasons for what The Economist magazine described as Ukraine's declining fortunes. One is a shortfall in its air defense interceptors, allowing Russian reconnaissance drones to establish what he calls continuous and dense surveillance. These, he said, in turn queue up ballistic missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian artillery in the rear and glide bombs against troops at the front, allowing Russia to make slow but steady advances in small units, often using motorcycles because tanks are too easy to spot. He also mentioned Ukraine's limited stock of shells, as well as tanks and armored vehicles, compounds the problem. The less firepower and armor available, the greater the reliance on infantry and the greater the casualties, he said. This is therefore a tacit admission that Ukraine, with less armor and firepower, suffers greater casualties than Russia. And here's how the article summarizes the current atmosphere in Washington, D.C. toward the Ukraine war. The gloomy mood is evident in a shift in America's language. Senior officials like Mr. Lloyd Austin still strike a confident note, promising that Ukraine will win. Those involved in the guts of planning in the Pentagon say that in practice, the ambitions of early 2023, that is, a Ukrainian force that could take back its territory or shock Russia into talks through a well-crafted armored punch, have given way to a narrow focus on preventing defeat. In quotations, at this point, we are thinking more and more about how Ukraine can survive. And perhaps this tragic situation that Ukraine has found itself in really did not have to occur. And it's not just for the obvious reason that the West inveigled them to throw away a far more beneficial peace deal in 2022. Rather, it's because, as was recently revealed in an interview with Tucker Carlson with Paul Manafort, a former American lobbyist who lobbied on behalf of the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine was never even interested in joining NATO.
Was Ukraine joining NATO something that most Ukrainians wanted or that Europe wanted?
No. NATO is a political issue. Joining the European Union is an economic issue.
Right.
And what the Ukrainians cared about was the economic issue. Yes, they wanted their independence, but they weren't fearful of Russia invading before, at that point. And the Russians didn't want NATO on the border of Ukraine.
Well, yeah. So why did the Biden administration, so if the Ukrainians weren't begging to be in NATO and NATO didn't want Ukraine in NATO, which I think is all true, correct me if I'm wrong.
You're correct.
Then why was the Biden administration, Kamala Harris specifically, calling in public for Ukraine to join NATO? Like, what would be the point of that?
Because they're idiots.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't justify a policy that the Europeans didn't want, the Ukrainians didn't want, and the Russians didn't want, and the U.S. was for.